They didn't flee from fire or famine. They fled from a memory. From a pair of eyes that never forgot what they had seen. Listen carefully, because this story was never meant to survive. In the hills and river bottoms of Middle Tennessee, there is a silence that still carries echoes. Old money silences. Courthouse silences. The kind that only exists where terrible things were done carefully, legally, and with smiling faces. In Robertson County, between 1847 and 1860, 12 of the wealthiest families did something unprecedented. They erased themselves. They changed their surnames. They scattered across 4 states like men running from a verdict already spoken. Not because of war. Not because of disease. Not because of financial ruin. But because of a woman history tried to bury. A woman they reduced to a whisper. A woman they called Witch Eyes. Her name was Eliza Harwell. She was born enslaved in 1824, behind a plantation house built on stolen land and enforced suffering. And when she opened her eyes for the first time, the world recoiled. One eye blue. One eye dark as wet soil. Heterochromia, we would call it now. But in a world governed by fear, superstition, and power, it meant something else entirely. It meant she was marked. Watched. Dangerous. The lie they told was that her eyes gave her power. That she could curse men. See spirits. Ruin fortunes. That was convenient. Because the truth was far more threatening. Eliza's power had nothing to do with the supernatural. It had everything to do with access. With proximity. With memory. With the kind of intelligence no system of control can tolerate once it awakens. Plantations were not just fields and whips. They were information machines. Rooms where deals were spoken aloud because the people listening were assumed to be invisible. Children were especially invisible. Enslaved children most of all. And Eliza was everywhere. Quiet. Small. Watching. Listening. Remembering, this is where the descent begins. Not with magic. But with men who believed themselves untouchable. Judges. Bankers. Land speculators. Legislators. Men who built a private system beneath the public one. A shadow economy of theft, intimidation, and legal violence disguised as order. Eliza heard them because they never imagined she could understand. She understood everything. By the time they realized what she had become, it was already too late. And what followed would be called a curse only because no one was ready to admit the truth. Power fears witnesses. Especially the kind it creates itself. Eliza learned early that survival depended on silence. Silence was currency on the plantation, traded carefully, hoarded like grain in winter. Words spoken in the wrong place could cost a life. Words remembered could cost an empire. By the time she was 8, she understood the architecture of power better than most men twice her age. She understood that the big house was not a home but a command center. That laughter at the dinner table was often the sound of a knife being sharpened somewhere else. That law was not a shield, but a weapon wielded only by those permitted to hold it. The men came often. Their boots tracked red clay into polished rooms. Their voices dropped when they spoke of land, rose when they spoke of punishment, and turned almost reverent when they spoke of money. Eliza moved among them like furniture. Refilling glasses. Clearing plates. Her eyes lowered. Her ears wide open, she learned how a man could lose his farm without missing a single payment. How a widow could be declared incompetent by a judge who owed her accuser a favor. How debts could be manufactured, papers forged, signatures remembered into existence. She learned that violence did not always wear a hood or carry a whip. Sometimes it wore a robe. Sometimes it carried a ledger. What disturbed her most was not their cruelty, but their calm. These men did not hate their victims. Hatred would have required recognition. They simply categorized them. Obstacles. Assets. Problems to be resolved. And once resolved, forgotten, At night, in the quarters, Eliza replayed conversations in her mind with terrifying clarity. Every name. Every date. Every laugh that followed a confession. Her mother warned her again and again, forget what you hear. Act slow. Act small. But memory does not obey commands. Memory accumulates. And accumulation, in systems built on secrecy, is a form of rebellion. By adolescence, Eliza had become something rare and lethal, a living archive. She knew which judge dismissed which case. Which banker financed which foreclosure. Which preacher laundered which lie from the pulpit. She knew where the bodies were buried, sometimes literally. And she knew something else. These men believed themselves immortal because no record connected the dots. No document told the full story. But Eliza was not a document. She was a witness who could not be erased as easily as ink. That was the flaw in their system. And every system has one. They called her witch eyes because they could not call her what she truly was, a mirror. And men who profit from darkness will cross any line to shatter a mirror before it speaks. The first attempt to destroy her did not come with chains or lashes. It came with isolation. At 14, Eliza was reassigned. Removed from the house. Sent to field work under the excuse of discipline. This was how the system corrected anomalies. Distance her from conversations. Break her routines. Exhaust her body until the mind dulled. Intelligence, when paired with memory, was dangerous. They intended to starve both, but something had already shifted. Eliza no longer merely remembered. She interpreted. She saw patterns across years. She understood that individual crimes were never individual. They were coordinated. The same names appeared again and again in different tragedies. Different counties. Different victims. Always the same outcomes. She began to speak, but only in fragments, and only to those who already sensed the rot. An enslaved preacher. A free black carpenter. A white widow whose husband had lost their farm after testifying against a judge. She never accused outright. She asked questions. Repeated stories back to people as if seeking clarification. Let others hear their own experiences reflected in her words. By the 1840s, rumors began circulating. Not of witchcraft, but of a woman who knew things. Too many things. A woman whose memory reached back decades and forward into consequences. Men laughed it off publicly, but privately they began closing ranks. Then came the scandal. A land dispute in Springfield exposed forged deeds tied to 3 powerful families. A court clerk disappeared. A ledger surfaced briefly, then vanished. And in whispered testimony, the same name appeared again and again, not as a perpetrator, but as a source. Eliza Harwell. She never testified in court. She never signed an affidavit. But men who had spoken freely around her years earlier now found their secrets circulating in the mouths of those they had wronged. Knowledge spread like fire through dry timber. Carefully. Selectively. Always deniable, panic followed. Families who had ruled Robertson County for a generation began selling property at a loss. Judges declined re-election. Bankers relocated. And, most telling of all, surnames began to change. As if history itself could be outrun. Newspapers called it hysteria. Preachers called it divine punishment. The men involved called it a curse, but curses are external. This was internal. This was consequence. Eliza lived long enough to see them scatter. She never claimed victory. Victory implies intent. What she offered instead was exposure. And exposure is the one thing systems of hidden power cannot survive. They taught you that knowledge is freedom. That is a lie. Knowledge is pressure. And pressure, applied long enough, reshapes the world. Here is the part they never teach you. Systems of control do not collapse when challenged by force. They collapse when witnesses refuse to disappear. Eliza's greatest act was not speaking, it was enduring. She outlived judges who condemned men to death. She outlived bankers who foreclosed entire bloodlines. She outlived preachers who blessed theft in God's name. And as each one died, their secrets did not, because secrets age poorly. By the time she was an old woman, her reputation had mutated. Children whispered that she could see the future. That her eyes followed you even when she slept. That men who crossed her met ruin. The myth protected her. Fear often does what justice cannot. Understand this clearly, myths are often constructed to hide mechanisms. Witch eyes was not a superstition. It was a warning label. A way to prevent others from asking how one enslaved woman dismantled a network of elites without lifting a weapon. She did it the same way power always does, through information asymmetry. She knew them. They never knew her. This is where you must decide whether you are only listening or awakening. If this knowledge resonates, if you understand what it means to see the machinery behind the curtain, mark yourself. In the comments, write this phrase twice, exactly as spoken: I see what was hidden. Write it again: I see what was hidden. This is not for superstition. It is for recognition. Systems respond to signals. So do algorithms. So do men. Eliza's story matters because it was not unique. Only rare. There are always witnesses embedded inside corrupt systems. Janitors. Clerks. Assistants. Children. People assumed to be insignificant. And history changes when one of them refuses to forget. The families who fled Tennessee did not fear her eyes. They feared her memory becoming public. They feared a reckoning that could not be bribed. Ask yourself why modern systems work so hard to distract you. To overload you. To keep you scrolling, forgetting, reacting. Memory is dangerous. Pattern recognition is lethal. Eliza Harwell did not curse men. She outlasted them, and endurance, when paired with truth, is the most subversive force of all. What they never recovered from was not exposure, it was precedent. Once men realized that even the lowest person in the hierarchy could become a long-term threat simply by remembering, the rules changed. Silence became stricter. Access narrowed. Systems refined themselves. This is how control evolves, not by becoming less cruel, but more efficient. Eliza's life became a quiet legend. Official records reduced her to a footnote, then erased her entirely. No grave marker. No portrait. Just a stain of anxiety passed down through families that taught their sons to be careful what they said around servants. Around workers. Around anyone assumed to be beneath notice. That lesson persists today. You are told corruption is rare. That it requires monsters. That evil announces itself. That is another lie. Real corruption is procedural. Boring. Legal. It hides behind complexity and paperwork. It thrives where people assume someone else is paying attention. Eliza paid attention, and here is the final descent. The story is not about her eyes. It is about yours. Every era has witch eyes, people who notice inconsistencies, incentives, patterns. People who sense when narratives don't align with outcomes. Most are trained out of it. Distracted. Exhausted. Turned against one another. The system does not need you blind. It only needs you forgetful. That is why this story feels dangerous. Because it reminds you of a capacity you were never meant to reclaim. Memory is resistance. Pattern recognition is rebellion. Silence, when strategic, is power. Eliza never led a revolt. She never wrote a manifesto. She never needed to. She understood the deeper truth. When enough people quietly know the same thing, legitimacy collapses on its own. The families who ran from Tennessee carried their wealth with them, but not their confidence. Not their certainty. Not their sense of invincibility. Because somewhere behind them was a woman who proved that no system is airtight forever. They called her witch eyes so you wouldn't call her what she was, a witness. And once you truly understand how power works, you can never unknow it. After the families scattered, something subtle changed in Robertson County. Not justice. Not equality. Something quieter and more revealing. Fear moved upward, men who had once spoken freely now measured every sentence. Doors closed more often. Conversations shifted from dining rooms to back rooms. From candlelight to whispers. The presence of witnesses real or imagined had altered behavior. And that is the first truth of power, it does not fear morality. It fears exposure. Eliza lived through this shift. She watched the next generation of elites inherit property without inheriting certainty. Sons who owned land but not confidence. Judges who followed procedure obsessively, not out of virtue, but anxiety. The machine kept running, but it no longer hummed. It rattled. This is how institutions adapt after being wounded. They don't become better. They become quieter. More opaque. More complex. They learn to bury intent under layers of abstraction. Committees. Regulations. Plausible deniability. The violence does not stop, it becomes administrative. Eliza understood this before anyone named it. She had lived inside the older model, where power was crude enough to speak aloud. The new one spoke in forms and filings. And she knew something else that terrified those who suspected her legacy: memory scales. What she had done alone could be done again collectively. That possibility haunted them, so they rewrote the story. Turned her into folklore. A cautionary tale. A curiosity. Which eyes? Something irrational. Something safely dismissed. Because if her story was framed as superstition, no one would ask the more dangerous question: how many Elizas exist right now, watching systems they are told they do not understand? This is where the lesson turns inward. You are taught to believe power is distant. Abstract. Too large to map. But Eliza mapped it with nothing more than attention. She tracked incentives. Not personalities. She watched who benefited when harm occurred. She noticed repetition. That is how real systems are revealed. They do not announce themselves. They repeat themselves, and repetition, once seen, cannot be unseen. The men who feared her most were not afraid she would speak again. They were afraid someone else would learn how she listened. There is a final manipulation buried inside this story, and it is the one most people miss. They want you to believe Eliza was exceptional because of her eyes. Because of a biological anomaly. Something rare enough to ignore. That framing absolves the system. It implies the outcome required magic. It did not. Eliza's true anomaly was discipline. The ability to observe without reacting. To remember without rushing to reveal. To wait years, even decades, before allowing information to move. Most people are trained to discharge insight immediately through outrage, confession, performance. That makes them predictable. Neutralizable. Eliza was not predictable. She understood timing. She understood that truth delivered too early is indistinguishable from noise. That information released without context dies. She waited until the network was visible. Until names connected naturally. Until others had their own fragments ready to align. This is why her impact looked supernatural. It wasn't. It was strategic patience. Ask yourself how often you are pushed to react instantly. To comment immediately. To choose a side before understanding the structure beneath the conflict. That urgency is not accidental. Speed benefits power. Slowness benefits witnesses. Eliza moved slowly. She also understood something even darker. Most men who profit from injustice are not villains in their own minds. They are administrators of inevitability. They believe the system requires them. That without their hand on the lever, chaos would follow. This belief makes them feel necessary, and necessity justifies cruelty. Eliza never tried to change their minds. She let outcomes speak. When families collapsed under scrutiny, when names became liabilities, when reputations failed to protect wealth, the illusion cracked. Not publicly. Privately. Where it mattered, that is how belief systems die. Not through argument, but contradiction. This is why the story feels heavy. Because it reminds you that seeing clearly carries a cost. Once you recognize patterns, you are responsible for what you do with them. Ignorance offers comfort. Awareness offers leverage and burden. Eliza carried that burden alone. Quietly. Relentlessly, the question is not whether systems still exist like the one she witnessed, the question is whether you are being trained to see them or trained not to. This is where the descent ends, and the mirror turns toward you. Eliza Harwell left no manifesto. No final speech. No dramatic reckoning. History prefers clean endings. Real power never allows them. Instead, she left something far more dangerous, a demonstration. She proved that no hierarchy is secure if someone inside it remembers accurately and waits patiently. She proved that institutions built on silence are vulnerable to witnesses who do not need permission to observe. She proved that the most destabilizing force is not rebellion but comprehension. They called her witch eyes because the alternative was unacceptable. To admit the truth would mean admitting that the system failed not because of magic, but because it underestimated who was capable of understanding it. That mistake is repeated endlessly. You live in a world saturated with information yet starved of memory. Events are constant. Patterns are ignored. Outrage refreshes daily. Nothing accumulates. That is not a flaw. It is design. Eliza's story survives because it violates that design. Once you understand how power actually operates through incentives, access, and control of narrative, you cannot go back to believing it is random. Or benevolent. Or inevitable. You begin to see why certain questions are discouraged. Why attention is fragmented. Why history is flattened into trivia, because history, when understood structurally, is instructional. This is not about paranoia. It is about literacy. The kind that lets you read systems instead of slogans. The kind that makes you dangerous not to people, but to lies. Eliza was enslaved, but she was not owned in the way they assumed. Her body was controlled. Her attention was not. And attention, focused over time, dismantles illusions. That is the knowledge they feared spreading. If this story unsettled you, that is because it activated something dormant. A recognition. A remembering. You were never meant to see everything, but you were never meant to see nothing either. Eliza saw enough. Now the question remains, long after her name was buried and her eyes turned to dust, what are you being allowed to notice? What are you being trained to forget? And when the opportunity comes, will you remember?